and welcome to Conversations with Joy. Thank you for tuning in. This week we have Kevin McCarthy, and I'm so excited to have him and to learn more of his story and sort of his path. And so welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Joy. Good to be with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. So you have authored several books, correct?
Yes.
What was the first one?
The first one was The On Purpose Person.
Okay, and when was that?
That was actually written in 1991 to 92 is when I wrote it, and it was released in 1992.
Okay, so what led you to write that book?
Well, there's the long story of it. There's a long story and a short story, and I'll give you the short story in light of what, to be kind to the viewers, if you will.
Right.
The short story is that basically I saw a lot of men that I knew that were going through tough times in their lives, where they were struggling with their career, their marriage, their family. I was at the time in my early 30s, mid-30s, and I felt like I had been a student of what I'm going to call personal leadership work for about 15 years at that point. Mm-hmm. And that there was something not addressed in the literature, and everything I would read say, find your purpose in life and then go live it, or articulate what's most important to you, or create your vision, or there were all these things that people would tell you to do these things, but nobody told you how to do it. And so it was a combination of just sort of this welling up of me of seeing some really good people I knew that were going through some struggles, some information I had, and this personal sort of transformational piece of me, for me, of even just really looking at some challenges in my own life. And I began to develop this process of clarifying who we are, why we're here, where we want to go with our lives, and how we get there. And then I had a simple process, and I started sharing it with some people, and they were like, well, that's kind of nice and everything. And then I realized that if I could write a story around it, that they would actually read it more, because the story would draw them along, and the process was there. So I originally started with a process, wrote the story of the on-purpose person around it. And so that's really the genesis of some of that work. And of course, at the same time, as a business advisor, I was also looking at it and recognizing that the businesses I was working with, if the leader got on purpose, in my language, if the leader got on purpose, then the business tended to follow much more easily.
That's fascinating. So tell me about your history, as far as your work history and that kind of stuff, before writing the book.
Okay, I mean, I've been an entrepreneur all my life. I was a kid that sold candy on the bus, so I feel like I've been in business for 50 years, even though I'm 58. Okay, I've really been in business for 50 years. I mean, I used to read Fortune. I'd flip through Fortune and Forbes magazine. My dad would bring it home when I was a little kid. So I loved those sorts of things. So you take an entrepreneur, then you combine that with a tennis player, because I started teaching tennis very young. When I was about 11 and 12, I was teaching tennis. And so I began to make money doing that. I'd get paid $2 an hour to throw balls for a tennis pro while he'd give lessons and I would learn. Then I went to undergraduate and got an undergraduate degree in business and economics with a major in finance. And I wanted to understand money. And then worked for a couple years at a bank for a period of time, and then I went into a bankrupt tennis, racquetball, and swim club outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my hometown, and was part of I was the manager that took over this club and took it out of bankruptcy and got it thriving again. It was a really cool experience, but it taught me I needed a lot more business education. So then I went on and got a business degree, a master's of business administration from the University of Virginia Darden School. Mm-hmm. That was just a phenomenal education in entrepreneurship and general management. It was really a great education. Went to work for a period of time in commercial real estate. Ended up as the president of a company called United States Properties, which is a very big sounding company, but it was actually me, another guy, and 2 assistants, and we had a team of people out in the field that worked with us, and we did about $25 million worth of development 1 year. Mm-hmm. And then we went through a business divorce,
right,
which was not fun.
Right.
And then through that, I really kind of came back and said, who am I? What am I really about? And I loved business. I liked real estate a lot. And I started doing commercial real estate advisory work, and what I found from the advisory work I was doing with the real estate is, because I was working with business owners, is most of the time they didn't have business plans, which meant I was back-ending into the business plan in order to create a real estate plan for them.
Right.
And I found out the reason they didn't have a real estate plan was because they didn't have a business plan. The reason they didn't have a business plan because they didn't have a life plan. The reason they didn't have a life plan is because they had real no sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. So I began to migrate into this along with my own personal interest in personal leadership and personal development. And so I, in essence, developed this on-purpose technology back in the mid-'80s. And then started sharing it, and then eventually wrote it up, as I said, and the On-Purpose Person came out in 1992, and then the On-Purpose Business Person was 1998, I believe it came out.
Now, when you wrote the On-Purpose Business, that was first, right?
On-Purpose Person was
On-Purpose
first.
Person was first, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Where was your faith, where were you on the faith path at that point?
Faith?
Uh-huh.
Well, interesting. That's part of the reason I wrote the On-Purpose Person was because I was a person who didn't really have, as my wife says, I was a good guy, but I was not a Christian. But I was, in 1986, when I went through my business divorce, we had started going to church together in 1984. And so it was a real time where my faith had come alive, because on February 14th, 1986, I was on an Episcopal Crucio, and it's when Jesus kind of went from my head to my heart.
Oh, nice.
And it happened to be Valentine's Day, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So whenever I was writing the On-Purpose Person, I realized I was really writing it for the person I was before I was a Christian, in terms of giving them Christian principles, because I never would have read a Christian-based book.
Right. Right.
And so I wanted a book that would sort of cross over. It's actually been very difficult for the book because people don't know what to do with it. But really the message is, do you have a purpose in life? And if you don't feel like you have a purpose in life, it doesn't matter what faith denomination or background you have, you're struggling.
Right, you're flailing.
You're flailing.
You have no direction.
Right. And so what I found is, while it is Christian-based, it meets people where they are, which is this place of, why am I here? Which is a purpose question. Where am I going? Which is a vision question. How will I get there? Mission question. And what's important? Which is a values question. And all of those sort of fall under this larger umbrella of, who am I? You know, where's my identity? And if we don't have our identity in Christ, we're really flailing. But if we don't even have those questions answered in some way, we're living life really on the edge, really difficult.
Why do you think before that day in February you would not have picked up a book that was Christian-based?
It was not relevant to me. The Bible was not relevant. People I knew that were Christians would say to me, well, in Genesis or in Chronicles it says this, or in James it says that, and I'm going like, who's that? I mean, it's like, it might as well have been talking to me in French, because it was a dictionary or a point of reference that was meaningless to me.
Right.
It was relevant to them, and I understood it was important to them, and I respected them for that, but it wasn't my point of view. It wasn't relevant to me. And so anything biblically based to me was just sort of, it was a non-reference point. It's probably the best way to say it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You seem like a very logical person. And
At times.
At times.
I'm certainly very emotional about what I do. I mean, I care for my children.
If you've always been like that, though. Or if that's something that came, or at least became more evolved after that day in February.
No, actually what's funny is, I think when you look at these personality profile tests and all that sort of stuff, I almost always score dead in the middle.
Right.
I'm sort of introvert, extrovert. It's those sorts of things. So at some level I'm analytical because I appreciate it, but it's interesting, I had a friend of mine that did one of those brain dominance tests, and he said, you're the most upper right brain dominant quadrant person I've ever met, which means you're extraordinarily creative. So I'm actually extraordinarily creative, but I'm very analytically trained.
Right.
So I try to marry the two of those, but left to my own devices, I think I'd be way out in the stratosphere, sort of.
Right, yeah.
trying to be not so heavenly minded and I'm no earthly good. You know, type
Yeah,
of
I
thing.
do know. Do you mind telling me about the day where the whole Jesus and God went from your head to your heart?
Sure. No, I'll be happy to talk about that. I mean, the day that first of all, it was a lot of years in the making. My wife and I, when we got married, I was a tennis player, and one of the things I sat down with her and said, what would be important to you in our marriage? And she said, well, I'd like to be able to have a Christian marriage. And I said, what's that? And she said, I'm not really sure, but it's what I would like it to be. It's, you know, one where Jesus is at the center. And I said, well, you know, Judith, I don't go to church. I'm not against it, but I was born on Christmas Day, so I've always had sort of a nice connection there, if you will. And our family grew up with my father going to church. He was Catholic, but my mother was not. And back then they would excommunicate you for marrying outside of your faith. So it was a sore spot in our family. In fact, we used to tease my father when he'd come back from church every Sunday morning about, hey, Dad, what was the sermon? What was it about? You know, we were just actually sort of antagonistic towards him, as children are prone to do to their parents anyway. So we were doing our job. What do you want? And and then we ended up. I said to her, well, if that's important to you, I'll give up tennis on Sunday mornings and I'll go to church. And of course, whenever I told the guys I played tennis with, they were all sort of rolling their eyes, going, "Oh, he's married now," you know, type of thing. But I ended up going to church and sat in the back of the church, and I wouldn't take communion because I didn't feel I was worthy, and kind of just listened. But as I listened, I realized that as the Bible was being read, that it was actually the root work of all of the self-help literature and personal leadership development stuff that I've been reading. And so I had an intellectual curiosity about the Bible at that point. And then there was a Bible study offered at our church during Lent. It's an Episcopal church, so during Lent we were doing this thing. And I got into that study with my wife, and it was the study of Romans, which is not the most easy to understand because the words justification, sanctification, it was just all these sort of big churchy words. But the people that were in the group loved me. And in fact, they were supposed to only meet from then and through Lent. But unbeknownst to me, they went to the rector of the church, Father Dave Wilson, and said, is it okay if we stay together for another year because we think Kevin needs it?
Oh, that's so awesome.
And they not only stayed together for 1 year, but they stayed together for 2 years and loved me. They got sort of special exemption to just keep the group together. And it was through that I ended up, some of those people and other people sponsored me to go into Crescio. So I was sort of learning and breathing and taking in the Bible. I was curious about it. I was fascinated by it. Again, more from an intellectual point of view of how do I apply this for personal leadership growth. But then whenever I was on that Episcopal Crescio, and suddenly I can't explain exactly why, but I just had this overwhelming sense of love. And I literally was in tears, crying and bawling my eyes out, uncontrollably yet happy. And there were just people there that knew me and loved me, some of the people from that group. And I just remember throwing my arms around a guy named Gene Pipkin and just crying my eyes out. And Gene just sitting there crying his eyes out. I call him my godfather, type of thing. And his wife, Shirley, is my godmother. In fact, at Mother's Day, I always give her a hug and say you're my spiritual mom, in that sense. And not to say that my parents haven't been good parents. They're great parents. But, it's just sort of at that level, that was where they met me. And that day, I just melted into a puddle of tears, and it was a good thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the Holy Spirit. No question, at least in my mind. Yeah. So, it took you about a year to write The On Purpose Person?
Actually, it took me a little bit, but I started writing in August. What happened is my wife and I had gone through infertility for 6 years, and we found out amazingly that she was pregnant. And we found out in August of probably 1991, and I'd had this book sort of stirring in me. Again, I'm not a journalism major or an English major, but I had this book stirring in me. And everybody I talked to said, if you have children, you don't have any time for anything else. And so I figured if I was going to write this, I better do it now. And of course, I had 2 books in me, The On Purpose Person and The On Purpose Business Person were both there, but I wanted to start with The On Purpose Person because I knew that was the place to break into the cycle, if you will. And I ended up writing it from August until about February, March. He was born in February.
Wow.
And then for a year, I desktop published it, and then I started to just share it with friends. And over a period of about a year, a lot of books were being bought. We sold, I don't remember exactly, but somewhere probably between 1,000 and 2,000 books, just pure word of mouth. It looked like a little cookbook. It had a plastic binding on it, and it was a quick print place. American Reprographics did it for me. And
this was in Orlando?
This was in Winter Park, yeah. And what happened then was book publishers found out about the book, and I ended up with 5 or 6 or 7 book publishers that contacted me with unsolicited to publish the book.
Now before, was it your initial inclination to self-publish, or did you send it out?
I just didn't care. I just was being obedient. I wrote the message, I put it down, I knew how to desktop publish even though it was the early 1990s. I had one of the early Macs that was I had the second ever Mac, and I desktop published it myself.
Oh, wow.
And I just put it out there, sort of throwing the fleece out there and seeing what comes back. And in fact, what was really cool, the first day I handed it out, it was to a group of, a CEO group that I was a part of. And there were 10 or 12 men in the group, and I handed it out that day. It was a Thursday, and within 24 hours, one of the guys in the group called me and said, Kevin, I want 30 copies of this to hand out to men at my Sunday school class. We need this, and I want to buy 30 copies. What's it cost? And I said, oh, I don't know. And he said, oh, and you need to put a cover on it. It just had a big clip on it, one of those big tiger clips, whatever they are. I handed it out that way, no cover or anything. He said, but you need to put a cover on it. So I did that. And then that same day I got a phone call from another guy that was in the group who said, Kevin, I gave your book to a friend of mine who works in my company with me, and he needed it. And that Friday afternoon, that guy calls me and said, I just read your book and this has changed my life. In fact, I'm going to sit down and reread it tonight, and then tomorrow morning I want to visit with my wife about it. And at that point, I said I was done. All I said is if it changed one person's life, that's all that matters. And within literally almost 30 hours, that answer was given to me. So I figured it was done. I put it aside. Well, the next thing I know, people are calling and ordering books, and the next thing I know, I've got publishing contracts, and I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? So it was sort of a God thing that just made it all happen. And now the book is distributed just in the U.S. alone, probably 250,000 copies. It was the #1 nonfiction book on Kindle in April of 2012 for the free download. We did a free download. 32,500 people downloaded it in 5 days.
Wow.
That was really amazing. It was cool.
So I hope this isn't a sore subject, but it feels like it's sort of the precursor to the purpose-driven life.
It's not a precursor in terms of maybe it paved the way for the purpose-driven life.
Right.
I think in some regards it may have paved the way. I think that Rick Warren was working in parallel. Now, he came out with Purpose-Driven Life sometime in 2003, 4, something like that maybe. I don't pay that much attention to him. But he'd already written a book in 1990. Remember, I came out in 1992 with The On Purpose Person. In about 1994, I think he came out with The Purpose-Driven Church, which is ironic because that would be the On Purpose business book, although we use purpose very differently. I don't believe we're driven, I believe we're called. So we're not purpose-driven, we're purpose-called. And he uses purposes, and I say there's one purpose. And he tends to define purposes as what I would call missions: fellowship, outreach, worship, and so on and so forth. To me, those are expressions of your purpose, where your purpose is really your identity in Christ. It is God's will for your life. It is intimate. It is personal. It is between you and God, but it's expressed through the visions. Through it, you have a vision that God gives you, and then you live that out through the missions, and then your values keep you, and particularly with the biblical values, those keep you sort of the guardrails that keep you from doing crazy things, perhaps.
Right.
When I say stupid things that guys can do or women can do, they get themselves in trouble.
Yeah. Okay. So then, how did you get from having affected two people's lives and being done, and okay, now I'm gonna have this baby and be a father, to what, 4 or 5 books now?
Well, in fact, I have 18 books. I have a list of 18 books I want to write. I mean, it's sort of funny. Here I am. I grew up believing as a businessman that I was going to be the guy that was going to come alongside of some artist, entrepreneur, and I was going to be their business sort of manager. And what I didn't understand was I became the talent. So I sort of flipped.
Yeah.
And so now I wear 2 hats poorly, one as the creative and the other as the business guy. And it's been a very difficult type of role to play, because I feel like every day I'm working 2 jobs. And so that's just been a challenge in that regard. But I have a book, it's called Fit for Leading, that's about leadership and looking at the 4 major obstacles that get in the way of our leading. I just wrote a book called On Purpose Peace, which is a companion guide for small groups for Christians who want to read the On Purpose person, but because, remember, it's a crossover book, they're not quite sure what to do with it. Well, now you take On Purpose Peace, which comes alongside of it, and it just blows open the Christian pieces of it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and that was only 20 years overdue. I got to it. I just finished it. I mean, we just got them from the printer the other day, so.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
And
don't want to rush these things.
well, you have plenty of time, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, how do you make sure that you are staying on purpose with this vision that you've been giving, that you're implementing throughout your life?
Well, again, I use the purpose vision. My purpose is being on purpose, so that's really saying, am I being in God's will? So I learned very early on to protect my private life. So I try to be very close to God in terms of worship, reading the Bible. I'm not the best prayer. I pray I'm sort of more conversational. I'm driving around talking to God, or just having these sorts of things. Or just somebody comes across my email and I just say a little prayer for them. And so those are the sort of things. I realize that the analogy I use is if there's God, self, and others, which is basically coming out of the Great Commandment. That a lot of us we build these self and others relationships very strongly. I describe that as though it's like if we were talking about the internet and bandwidth, that we build sort of a fiber optic system between us and others, but we have this little copper wire between connection to God, which doesn't allow a lot of data to flow.
Right.
So I really attempt to create more of a fiber optic network with God, and I'm willing to settle for a copper wire with others. Now, I don't think I have copper wires. I'm pretty involved and I help a lot of people. But at the end of the day, I understand I'm only as good as my relationship with God. Yeah. And so that's the place where I tend to do that. And as a result, it's probably, from a business point of view, probably hurt me at some level. But it has not, but I feel very wealthy in the sense that I've got a 29-year marriage, I've got 2 great kids, my parents are still around and I've got a great relationship with them, I have a brother. I have a lot of nice relationships that are out there, and at the end of the day, Jesus is a relationship, and it's a model of what our lives are supposed to be. Like we have a relationship,
right.
We have friendship that's
Absolutely.
there,
Yeah.
And so those are the joys of the life. Those are the true joys. How's that of life?
Yeah.
Are those relationships?
Well, I very much enjoyed the interview with Kevin McCarthy. It's so fascinating to me to experience or have someone talk about their creative process, especially someone who, like Kevin, is very business-minded and very logical person. And not only to talk about their creative process, but to talk about their walk with faith. And Kevin has an amazing mind. I think he has an amazing vision and an amazing ability to walk within His purpose, and therefore share that with the world. So, along those lines, I had such a great interview with Kevin that I am going to bring him back next week. We talked for a very long time, and all of it was very interesting stuff on leadership and faith and businesses and being on purpose, and the integration of spirituality into our business life.